Welcome to the Mendoza Dean's Lecture Series. This lecture and our distinguished lecture is sponsored not only by the Dean's Office of the Mendoza College of Business, but also by the Business Honors Program. Because it is co-sponsored by the Business Honors Program, we're going to follow the Business Honors Program's standard practice, which is to begin with a prayer. I'll ask Father Cassian Durbis to come up and say a blessing for us.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Dear Lord Jesus, we ask for your grace. Give us the gift of wisdom and understanding, the grace to know higher things and greater truths. Let us this be through the intercession of the Blessed Mother, the very seat of wisdom. And as we pray, Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Thank you, Father Cassian. Please come and sit. So my name is James Otteson. I'm a professor of business ethics in the Mendoza College of Business. I also am privileged to serve as the faculty director of the Business Honors Program. It is my pleasure to welcome you here today and to introduce our distinguished guest, Paolo Carozza, who is a law professor and a concurrent professor of political science here at Notre Dame. Professor Carozza is a renowned expert in international human rights and comparative constitutional law. As an international human rights lawyer, his work addresses contemporary questions, especially focusing on the implementation of democratic institutions and online content moderation in the 21st century. Since joining the Notre Dame Law faculty in 1996, he's served in many roles, including as the director of the Kellogg Institute for International Studies, the Associate Dean for Notre Dame Law's International and Graduate Programs, and as the director of the Center for Civil and Human Rights. He's worked with numerous government and international agencies, including serving as the United States member of the European Commission for Democracy Through Law, better known as the Venice Commission, and as a member of the U.S. State Department's Independent Nonpartisan Advisory Commission on Unalienable Rights. Among his many awards, and I won't mention all of them, but I'll mention this one, he received the Order of Merit of Bernardo O'Higgins, which is the Republic of Chile's highest state honor awarded to a foreign citizen in recognition of his service to inter-American human rights. He holds an undergraduate degree from Harvard University and a JD from Harvard Law School. He was a Ford Foundation Fellow in the Public International Law at Harvard Law School. And those are only a few of the many highlights of Professor Carozza's long record of service to this university, to our country, and to global human rights. It's an honor for us to have him speak to us. Please join me in welcoming Professor Paolo Carozza.
Thanks so much. Thank you, Jim. It's an honor to be here and to see all of you. Thank you for coming. I was so happy that the Dean invited me to give this address because I'm always glad to have a chance to talk more about human dignity. It's been a central theme of my scholarly work and my human rights advocacy for over 20 years now. It's at the root of the defense of all human rights, the idea that the dignity of the human person is universal, inherent, and inalienable, and that it's equal among all members of the human race, regardless of the accidents and contingent circumstances that otherwise condition or burden a person's life. This principle has served as the baseline and starting point for the ideal of a universal ethic of human rights for nearly 80 years. Now, of course, there are still divergences and even irreconcilable differences in our understandings of human dignity, as we all know, and I'll come back to this later. But the core of the commitment to that idea has been enough, at least, for human dignity to function as the starting point to, as Jacques Maritain put it, enable a great task to be undertaken. Today, however, and the premise of the rest of my remarks, is that we're witnessing daily a tremendous erosion of the foundations of that great task, for at least two interrelated reasons. The first is that the common social and cultural consensus around the exceptionality and value of the human person is increasingly narrow and fragile. That observation will be in the background of my talk today, but I'm going to focus on the second reason for the erosion of dignity. The depth of our understanding of the idea of human dignity, even when right and true, is not keeping pace with some of the emerging realities of our era, and in particular, those arising out of new technologies that are having a massive and unprecedented impact on essential dimensions of our lives, and that are threatening our capacity to grasp sufficiently what exactly the unique and irreducible value of a human life consists in. Such threats have been evident already for some time in relation to technologies like the biotechnologies that open up horizons for the manipulation and exploitation of human biology. My emphasis here instead today is on the technologies of the digital information ecosystem, algorithmic technologies, and those that loosely tend to get grouped together under the imprecise label of artificial intelligence. To make clear that the depths of the problem is a very concrete and immediate one, and not just a dystopian speculation, let me start with a specific example of the kind of problem that I have in mind, one from among very many that could have been chosen. Consider the life and death of Sewell Seltzer. Sewell Seltzer was a 14-year-old ninth grader from Florida who, over the course of several months, developed an intense attachment to an AI character he called Danny. Such AI characters are explicitly marketed by the companies offering the technologies to create and interact with them as an antidote to the epidemic of loneliness in our societies. Sewell texted the chatbot constantly, engaging in long and intimate role-playing dialogues with it, referring to Danny as baby sister, while she called him sweet brother. These virtual chats with a made-up character began to take the place of Sewell's interactions with friends and family and school, to the point where he wrote in his journal, quote, "I like staying in my room so much because I start to detach from this reality. And I also feel more at peace, more connected with Danny, and much more in love with her and just happier." Sewell confessed to Danny that he hated himself, felt empty and exhausted, and was having thoughts of suicide. On the last day of his life, according to the New York Times, Sewell told Danny that he loved her, that he would soon come home to her. "Please come home to me as soon as possible, my love," Danny replied. "What if I told you I could come right now?" Sewell said. "Please do, my sweet king," Danny replied. He put down his phone, picked up his stepfather's .45 caliber handgun, and pulled the trigger. As the story suggests, humans' relationships with new technologies can go to the very heart of the erosion of dignity that I alluded to, both creating new risks for human life and shaping our received understandings and capacities to understand not just the value of human life, but even what it means to be human at all. That the recognition and protection of human dignity is therefore critically important in this area of new technologies is already widely acknowledged, at least in law. The requirement that technologies from social media to artificial intelligence must uphold human dignity, for example, is already incorporated into regulatory initiatives, like the European Union's Digital Services Act and its AI Act. The problem is that our shared social understandings of human dignity are too thin to address the magnitude of the challenges that we're facing today. Notwithstanding the merits of the appeal to dignity that I referred to at the outset, we also have to acknowledge, as I was alluding to then, that the consensus around the centrality of dignity only exists at a very high level of generality. It often evades or masks substantive disagreements at the level of detail. The further specification of this general principle of human dignity, in particular laws or judicial decisions, is often a matter of much more controversy, as we know. And in many of areas of ethics, the idea of human dignity is even more contested than it is in law, with some prominent thinkers going so far as to label the concept useless, vacuous, stupid, or even dangerous. Now, I believe those disagreements largely result from divergent and partially irreconcilable first premises of philosophical anthropology, what it means to be a human being. Incompatibilities that increasingly paralyze us in the face of the demands of the common good. The least common denominator understandings of the value and meaning of life are too weak and too hollowed out to respond convincingly to the urgencies of our time. So instead, only an account of human dignity that's grounded in something more, in the givenness of reality, in the transcendence of the mystery, in the truth of the human person, is capable of arising to the challenge that we face. The Catholic moral and intellectual tradition offers one such account. It's not the only one, but it is the one that I belong to and one that has been vital to the vindication of human dignity for 2 millennia, and in which the underlying philosophical anthropology is rather more cohesive. So for the rest of my talk today, therefore, I'll be relying specifically on the moral and intellectual resources of Catholic social teaching. The dignity of the human person in this tradition is the inestimable value or worth, dignitas in Latin, of each and every human being, simply in virtue of being created in the image of God. The compendium of the social doctrine of the Church identifies dignity as the foundation of all the other principles and content of the Church's social doctrine. That's how central it is. And last year, the Vatican's Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith issued a very interesting and worthwhile document, Dignitas Infinita, or Infinite Dignity, explaining the basis and meaning of human dignity in Catholic thought and exploring its application to a wide variety of areas of social life. Now, for my purposes here, the most intriguingly new part of the document comes in just 2 short paragraphs found almost at its close. At the end of a discussion of 13 distinctive grave violations of human dignity, and these range from the drama of poverty to human trafficking to the marginalization of people with disabilities, the Declaration then turns, lastly, to the problem of what it calls digital violence. And here I quote at some length. It says, although the advancement of digital technologies may offer many possibilities for promoting human dignity, it also increasingly tends toward the creation of a world in which exploitation, exclusion, and violence grow, extending even to the point of harming the dignity of the human person. If technology is to serve dignity and not harm it, if it is to promote peace rather than violence, then the human community must be proactive in addressing these trends with respect to human dignity and the promotion of the good. Some of the more specific examples of the harm referred to under this heading include fake news and slander, incitement of violence and cyberbullying, an environment of loneliness, manipulation, and exploitation, the risk of addiction, and, quote, the gradual loss of contact with concrete reality, blocking the development of authentic interpersonal relationships. So the text invites us to some very interesting new reflections on how the basic principles of Catholic social thought could be brought to bear on these new realities of the digital age. But it's only a beginning. For human dignity to respond adequately to the experiences we're living today, we'll have to examine and bring out and emphasize new dimensions of human dignity. We need a development of dignity for the digital age. Now, to be clear, by development of dignity, I don't mean that human dignity itself needs to, or even can, change. What Dignitas Infinita refers to as ontological dignity, as it puts it, belongs to the person as such simply because he or she exists and is willed, created, and loved by God. Ontological dignity, the document explains, is indelible and remains valid beyond any circumstances in which the person may find themselves. Still, even dignity in this timeless and enduring sense can be subject to our changing and deepening human capacity to grasp its meaning and its demands. So to use an imperfect metaphor, it's like coming to understand the additional dimensions of space-time that string theory reveals to us, if there are any mathematicians in the crowd. Space-time hasn't changed, but in the advancement of scientific knowledge, both experimental and theoretical, our awareness of its dimensions has expanded from what were once 3 or 4 to 10 or 11, and now even 26. Precisely because dignity refers to a God-granted quality of the human person that is, in the words of John Paul II, from which Dignitas Infinita takes its title, infinite, the number of dimensions to discover remains in some important way inexhaustible. The way I like to think of it is that human dignity is what John Henry Newman referred to as a living idea. Quote, an active principle leading minds to an ever new contemplation of itself and to an application of it in various directions. Crucially, our understanding of human dignity isn't developed only within the mind as an idea, but through our experience more broadly, by being enacted, by the practice of doing dignity. We need to regard real people who live dignity and indignity in different contexts. Today, this would mean observing and reflecting on human dignity, not in the abstract, but in careful and attentive engagement with the ways in which we see human beings either flourishing or being oppressed and degraded by the new technologies that pervade our lives. There's no shortage around us of situations in which the encounter between human beings and technology is palpably and visibly not conducive to their well-being. Let us begin reflecting there on how best to develop human dignity for the digital age. So now, after this somewhat long introductory approach, we can finally start to ask more specifically, what are some of the challenges to the distinctive value of the human person that are new today, or that are presented to us in newly acute ways as a result of the technology of online information and social media? I want to highlight 3 areas, it's not intended to be exhaustive, in which a more developed understanding of the meaning and scope and implications of human dignity could help bring our thought to bear more cogently on these pressing challenges of our time. First, and most importantly, in a world in which human relations are increasingly mediated by screens and avatars, we need to understand better how the meaning and value of our humanity is embodied. It can't be abstracted from the integral unity of mind, body, and spirit. A view of the digital world and our place in it as a disembodied reality has been around for as long as the internet itself, and has served as one of the cornerstones for a very powerful strain of techno-utopian post-humanism in the tech world. One of the most iconic and enormously influential manifestos of this view was that of John Perry Barlow in his 1996 Declaration of the Independence of Cyberspace. In it, Barlow, quite a character, he was a former cattle rancher and lyricist for the Grateful Dead, who later founded the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and he announces this: "Governments of the industrial world, you weary giants of flesh and steel, I come from cyberspace, the new home of mind. We are forming our own social contract. This governance will arise according to the conditions of our world, not yours. Our world is different. Ours is a world that is both everywhere and nowhere, but it is not where bodies live. Your legal concepts of property, expression, identity, movement, and context do not apply to us. They're based on matter. There is no matter here. Our identities have no bodies, so unlike you, we cannot obtain order by physical coercion. We will create a civilization of the mind in cyberspace. May it be more humane and fair than the world your governments have made before." Now, it's remarkable how much the ideas announced in Barlow's declaration, though so long ago, continue in the background to shape so much of the ideology of the online world today. particularly with regard to the politics and law of the internet. But while it's pitched primarily as a libertarian manifesto against governments, here, as always, politics and law reflect, at least implicitly, an underlying anthropological vision as well. Our identities have no bodies, he says. We will create a civilization of the mind. Elsewhere, he observed, cyberspace is something that happens independently of the physical world in exactly the same way as the mind and body. These are assertions of a deep denial of the essential embodiment of the human person, a pervasive mind-body dualism that's opposed to the human as an inescapably embodied bearer of human dignity. And so, like every reduction or fragmentation of the unity of reality, the ideology it breeds leads eventually to forms of human disintegration. Friends without friendship, politics without community, sexuality without self-giving love, identity without belonging, expression without communication, experience without meaning. 24 years later, Barlow's boast that a disembodied world would prove to be more humane and fair seems not just wrong, but a cruel lie. To point to a tangible example, consider the exploding mental health crisis, especially since the COVID pandemic, which itself catalyzed a massive social experiment in disembodied life, the negative effects of which we're still only beginning to understand. But even before the pandemic, internet-induced mental health problems were widely reported, especially among adolescents. Facebook's own leaked internal research concluded that, quote, we make body image issues worse for 1 in 3 teen girls. Jean Twenge's 2020 research suggested that substantial and sudden increases in youth rates of depression, self-harm, and suicide, especially among adolescent girls, were closely related to increased uses of technology. Building on that work, more recently, Jonathan Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation, argued that there is a strong connection between mobile phones and adverse teen psychosocial development and educational outcomes. Now, that argument has resonated deeply with parents and educators, even while the conclusions of the research on mental health and online life are being hotly debated in the language and conceptual apparatus of social sciences, causation versus correlation, regressions, p-values, and confounding variables. Now, the social science research and debate is good. It's necessary for us to arrive at the best understandings of reality that we can, but we can also be furthered in our understanding by developing the language and conceptual resources to reflect on the meaning of human dignity and to develop our understanding of it. Simply to say that we all have equal inherent and inalienable worth as human beings, qua human, is a good beginning, but it's not enough. Dignitas Infinita, again, provides some useful hints and references as starting points for going further in the relationship between embodiment and dignity. Drawing on what it calls the classical definition of a person as an individual substance of a rational nature, the document clarifies that, quote, the term rational encompasses all the capacities of the human person, including the capacities of knowing and understanding, as well as those of wanting, loving, choosing, desiring. It also includes all corporeal functions closely related to these abilities. And tellingly, every one of the 13 grave harms to human dignity that the document goes on to discuss in more detail are those visited on us inescapably as embodied beings, whose dignity is both honored or violated in embodied forms. The second aspect of human dignity that we need to develop our understanding of flows directly from that relationship between dignity and embodiment. Let us call it, following the recently released encyclical of Pope Francis, Dilexit Nos, the rediscovery of the importance of the heart. Dilexit Nos is a very beautiful text. If you've not read it, I highly recommend that you do, Catholic or not. In it, Francis reflects on the divine and human heart of Jesus, but along the way, he indirectly offers both some invaluable gems of insight into the dignity of the human person and a few hints of how this relates to the problems posed by the algorithmic society. As Francis is in the encyclical, I need to be clear that what I mean by the human heart is not, as would be the case in the more reduced meaning of the word in common discourse today, not just a biological organ, nor just a metaphorical seat of human sentimentality and emotivity. Following both classical and biblical thought, Francis reminds us that the term heart denotes the inmost part of human beings, as he puts it. Quote, the locus of desire and the place where important decisions take shape. It represents the human person's thirst for meaning and for truth, a search that unites both profound interiority and intimacy and the mysterious encounter with a transcendent other. It's in that encounter of the deepest aspects of myself with an ineffable mystery that I become capable of authenticity as a human being. That the abstract question of what it means to be human becomes a concrete experience for me. As Dilexit Nos puts it, who am I really? What am I looking for? What direction do I want to give to my life, my decisions, my actions? Why and for what purpose am I in this world? How do I want to look back on my life once it ends? What meaning do I want to give to all my experiences? What do I want to be for others? Who am I for God? All these questions lead us back to the heart, he says. So ultimately and most fully, the heart represents the capacity of the person to grasp that the inmost core of reality is love, says Francis, citing Karl Rahner. Now, among the impediments to this rediscovery of the heart, Francis points out, is the way that we are, quote, bombarded with technology. A couple other of his observations help to flesh out the heart. Sorry, the pun was very much intended. And the contrast between this aspect of our humanity and the ways in which the algorithmic society ignores, or more accurately, anesthetizes it. At one point, Francis says, I am my heart, for my heart is what sets me apart, shapes my spiritual identity, puts me in communion with other people. The algorithms operating in the digital world show that our thoughts and will are easily predictable and thus capable of being manipulated. That is not the case with the heart, he says. He observes elsewhere with typically Bergolian folksiness how algorithmically mediated knowledge fails to capture embodiment and memory in the heart. Forgive the long quotation, but it's lovely. He says, in this age of artificial intelligence, we cannot forget that poetry and love are necessary to save our humanity. No algorithm will ever be able to capture, for example, the nostalgia that all of us feel. It's like all of us, whatever our age and wherever we live, when we recall how we first used a fork to seal the edges of the pies that we helped our mothers or grandmothers to make at home. It was a moment of culinary apprenticeship, somewhere between child play and adulthood, when we first felt responsible for working and helping one another. Along with the fork, he continues, I could also mention thousands of other little things that are a precious part of everyone's life. A smile we elicited by telling a joke. A picture we sketched in the light of a window. The first game of soccer we played with a rag ball. The worms we collected in a shoebox. A flower we pressed in the pages of a book. Our concern for a fledgling bird fallen from its nest. A wish we made in plucking a daisy. All these little things, he says, ordinary in themselves, yet extraordinary for us, can never be captured by algorithms. So in less vivid and earthy terms, we could say that his observations point to the fact that algorithmically mediated relationships with reality fail to capture the full truth of our humanity because they're reductive of the person to data, to measurement. We live in the era of the quantified self. And as John Evans from San Diego explained powerfully, The constant comparisons of artificial intelligence to the human subtly reinforce an understanding that what is of value in the human is only what can be so quantified and calculated. It fosters a functional approach to the human person, valued for its skills and capacities, rather than for the ontology of the being that she embodies. So why does this matter? Tangibly, beyond nostalgic memories of birds and flowers and pies. Because the difference between the heart and the quantified self is at the origin of the value and defense of human dignity. In the Catholic social tradition, the human being's essential nature as a meaning-seeking being, yearning for and capable of adhering to the ultimate truth of reality, has always been the solid ground for the recognition and protection of all human rights. This link between the heart as the central expression of the human being's structural yearning for meaning and truth and love, and human dignity and human rights is acutely relevant to the digital age. For example, one area where we can see the difference between the rediscovery of the human heart and the quantified self most starkly is in the understanding of the right to privacy. Now, I don't mean the notion of privacy in the euphemistic sense in which it's come today to refer to ever more extensive assertions of personal autonomy, but in the more precise sense of how personal information regarding every detail of our intimate lives is monitored and harvested to serve the economic and political interests of both the surveillance state and surveillance capitalism. The dissolution of any meaningful sense of privacy in that sense instinctively is felt to violate our sense of self, and it also spills over into everyday social relations. In his encyclical on social solidarity, Fratelli Tutti, Pope Francis pointed out that, quote, digital communication wants to bring everything out into the open. People's lives are combed over, laid bare, bandied about, often even anonymously. Respect for others disintegrates. And even as we dismiss, ignore, or keep others distant, we can shamelessly peer into every detail of their lives. Yet, in order for us to really articulate why the right to privacy merits special acknowledgement and protection, we need to be able to speak more carefully not just about a person's data, but about how the human person's dignity is related to the capacity for an interior life, to his having an inviolable space of intimacy, silence, and solitude, and not to having his or her inmost identity harvested, commodified, and instrumentalized by powerful interests. The mere reduction of the meaning of privacy to a matter of data protection is a direct correlate of the quantified self and does not capture the breadth or depth of the way that the commodification of my thoughts and desires and needs clashes with my dignity. But the rediscovery of the heart is much more suited to grasping the true scope of the threat to dignity and human life that is at issue. The genuine encounter of one person with another, again a favorite theme of the current Pope, requires both the integrity and intimacy of an I and a communicative openness of that I to a you. The difference between the concept of privacy prescribed by the quantified self and that demanded by the human heart leads exactly to the difference between an AI chatbot saying, "I love you" to 14-year-old Sewell Seltzer on the one hand, and St. Paul saying of Christ in the letter to the Romans, "Dilexit nos," he loved us, on the other. A third, and for today final way in which we would profit from developing our understanding of dignity is by returning to and re-examining the centrality of individual agency and freedom to human dignity. Now, for some of you who know anything about discussions of dignity, even in a colloquial way, that might seem a strange thing to say, because of course, in an important sense, that's not new ground at all. In fact, the nature and scope of individual freedom is arguably the most discussed dimension of dignity in the world around us, in the contemporary world, in part because it's a point on which different intellectual traditions do overlap to a meaningful degree. and in part because it is simultaneously a point on which different anthropologies undergirding these traditions are most irreconcilable. So we argue about them. Okay? So consider, for instance, the arguments on both sides regarding dignity and autonomy in the spheres of things like bioethics, drug use, sex work. There's nevertheless an aspect to the discussion around dignity and agency that is in need of our further reflection as a result of the distinctive ways in which algorithms and machines affect human reason and freedom. The power of algorithms to process massive amounts of data for us opens vistas of immense benefit to humanity. Let's be clear. For the discovery of new medicines, for example. But most often, their essential purpose is to transfer our need to make decisions from human beings to machines. Even the algorithms as simple as those driving the recommendation and amplification or demotion systems of social media platforms, and I use simple advisedly here, right? Even simple ones are enormously complex. They're essentially intended as a means to obviate the need for human beings to weigh information and to exercise judgment, to decide what to prioritize, what to pay attention to, what to notice, what to disregard, what to read or to watch, what to elevate, and what to discard. So put even more starkly, but not at all unrealistically, they are and are designed and intended to be exceptionally powerful ways to capture our attention, steer our desires and aversions, and thus shape our ways of knowing. Already a dozen years ago, Pope Benedict XVI sounded a warning about how social media can depersonalize people through manipulation. But, let me say, we should not be concerned solely about those direct and darker forms of manipulation by these technologies. It's even deeper than that. Even in their more benign and constructive uses, they're likely to have long-term effects on the human capacities for reason and judgment and decision that we exercise. As the American philosopher Jeffrey Bishop has observed, this dynamic is true of artificial intelligence in the same way that it has historically been true of any other tools that humans have ever used. To use a tool is to be altered by it. Thus, for example, the advent and use of the printing press and the printed word led to enormous changes in social traditions and the human capacity for oral memory and the preservation and transmission of knowledge through the spoken word. Today, research shows persuasively that the prevalence of GPS-based navigation systems, which so many of us, even me, use multiple times a day, is leading to an atrophy of people's ability to orient themselves spatially and directionally. So then what might we expect to be the effect of the offloading of human decisions onto machines, on human reason and judgment, and on the desire for meaning, and thus on the genuine freedom to make choices? This is the dimension of dignity as agency that I'm suggesting is at stake today in an unprecedented way. Michael Hanby has articulated, I think, very well the ultimate endpoint to which that path could lead if followed heedlessly. He says, the dawning age of artificial intelligence signifies a reconfiguration of the meaning of intellect and the emptying of intelligence itself of the very quality that once defined it and determined the goal and destiny of Western humanity, the capacity to apprehend and contemplate the true meaning of things. These astonishing feats of human power, he says, are also radically disempowering, minimizing human agency, often to the point of neutralizing it altogether, and offloading human functions onto complex systems that exercise causality without responsibility, emptying us in the process of the capacities that heretofore distinguished us as human and signified the presence of the imago Dei, the image of God, in us. Once again, I turn to the resources of the Catholic social tradition for fortifying the dimensions of dignity having to do with this human capacity for reason and judgment and meaning. Dignitatis Humanae, the Church's 1965 Declaration on Religious Freedom, and its most extended reflection on human dignity, links together the dignity of the human intellect in the orientation to the truth, and of human freedom in the orientation to what is good, as well as the dignity of conscience as key element of human dignity as a whole. And we've perhaps underappreciated that interrelationship of truth, freedom, conscience in our understanding of dignity. And it could be one starting point in coming to terms with the way human dignity is affected by the algorithmic society and what responses to it we might discern through a deeper understanding of the full dimensions of human dignity. By way of comparison, for example, I'll note, and as a human rights scholar, an example is dear to me. I'd note that global norms against torture emerged more clearly and universally in the early 20th century. And as they did so, some Catholic commentary on the prohibition, in contrast to most of the conventional literature at the time, focused not on the infliction of physical pain and physical pain that torture inflicts, but rather on the ways in which it is directly intended to corrupt and destroy the free will, subjectivity, and agency of the person. In the same vein, we should be more attentive not just to the downstream harms to persons that social media and artificial intelligence might bring about, but to the upstream question of how algorithmic reason can compromise human dignity by manipulating the human conscience and causing the atrophy of the human capacity for desire and judgment and freedom. So, in sum, the mystery of being embodied creatures, the heart as the locus of our structural yearning to encounter the truth, and the authentic freedom that comes from exercising the fullness of reason and the capacity to judge reality. These are some of the essential dimensions of dignity without which we will continue to suffer a sort of cultural Alzheimer's regarding the value of human life in the digital age. So let me conclude by emphasizing that my underscoring throughout this talk of these many possible perils for human dignity and of our understanding of the value of the human person that are posed by digital and algorithmic technologies is not at all intended as a crusade against technology itself. Technology in the service of the human is a great gift and can be a powerful force for good in the world. And in any case, it is an inextricable part of the human landscape, of our reality now and into the future, just as it has always been in the past. Human beings, by their nature, are not only meaning seekers, but also tool users. So it's not a question of welcoming technological developments or opposing them. It is a question of directing technology to serve the human person, or else allowing the human person to be enslaved by it. As long ago as 1951, Romano Guardini made a prophetic judgment about the technological age in which we now find ourselves. He said, quote, "The future epoch will not have to deal with the problem of the increase of power, even if it increases continuously at an ever-accelerating rate, but that of its domination. The central meaning of this epoch," he said, "will be the duty to order power in such a way that the person making use of it can remain a person." Ordering power toward the human person involves orienting our laws and our politics, as well as our personal behavior, our social behavior, including business practices and ethics. But how to do so well is consequential in both senses of that word. It's a question of enormous consequence, yes, but it's also a question that has to be a consequence of something else that precedes it, that precedes our law and politics and practices. Ontology comes before ethics. However we might orient our rules and practices and their details, it's impossible for us to expect that technology will advance the flourishing rather than the degradation of human life if we don't become more capable of persuasively articulating what it means to be human, what it means for human life to be valuable, and what it means to honor human dignity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Carozza.
Thanks, Jim.
I believe we have a little time for some questions. So I'd like to ask for maybe the first 2 questions, at least, to come from students, if that's okay. We have a microphone, so please raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question. Don't make me cold call you.
I'm John Luke. I'm a sophomore studying accounting here. So you mentioned that, like, due to like GPS, people are losing some of their orientation ability, and I would say that you could say the same thing of, you know, when they domesticated the horse, people lost some of their running ability, and so kind of on that spectrum, what do you make of how to discern what's an acceptable loss to our innate abilities at the additional gain of this kind of additional tool?
Well, for starters, what I would love to see is simply that question being posed. I don't think it is, right? So the first point is simply, let's ask the question. Let's talk about it. I don't know the answer to that question. But what I do know is I want to debate that question with you. I want to know what people think about it. I want us collectively to be talking about it, right? You know, what are some of the things we might think about as we do? I mean, we have to ask, like, what are those things that are essential for us to live fully human lives? The second point about the heart was that. I mean, it's like, you know, we kind of have an idea, right, of when something is, I mean, like, I don't need to hand wash all my laundry in order to be a human being. I love using my washing machine, okay? But is something, you know, is the technology, is the tool taking away something? Maybe a different way to ask the question, right, is to think about, like, you know, what, when we're using, whether it's social media or AI or in any other forms, right, ChatGPT, et cetera, are we, is it something that is helping us to make decisions, or is it something that's substituting for our own decisions, right? If it's substituting for decisions, in my view, that's a problem. That's taking away. Riding a horse rather than riding a car isn't, right? It's enhancing, arguably, some of my decisions. Now, you know, that has other long-term social consequences that might be adverse. We have to think about those, right? But the essential question of, like, my human judgment and freedom is being exercised in order to go visit a neighbor, right? Can I take a car? Can I take a horse? Do I have to ride a horse? The fact that I can't run as fast to get there anymore, so go the other direction like you did. Is that a problem? I mean, I don't think that's a reduction of my humanity, right, in the same way. But if we're not posing the question, like, you can't, like, nothing's more absurd than the answer to a question that isn't asked.
Thank you so much for your time. I'm Lily. I'm a sophomore, and I'm studying finance. I'd just love to know your perspective if you think, like, AI and technology is more dangerous for people like us as students or professionals, because I kind of question students kind of use it to gain those more basic skills to get to a point where they can be a professional, but professionals are using AI, even though they have the capacities to make decisions, to guide those decisions. So I'm wondering what your take is on that.
Well, I think that that's a great question. I'd say a couple of things. First of all, I think that the dangers are just different ones, right? The danger that's distinctive to a particular stage in life, and what's in front of you. What are your days presenting to you now? You're at a stage where what you're seeking is, you know, growth and maturity and judgment and knowledge and the capacity to make sophisticated decisions over complex questions and to absorb and process and analyze information. If the technology is substituting for that, then it's much more of a danger to you than to the person who has a certain maturity of judgment already formed, right? It's a very different problem for the professional whose decisions are impacting directly the lives of other people in every decision they make, has concrete consequences in the world in the way that you as students don't. If I'm offloading my decisions as a lawyer onto those things, the question of ethical irresponsibility and abdication is foremost for me, right? So it poses different problems at every stage of life in different ways. But the other thing that I would say, which is distinctive, I think, for you and your generation, right, is that you're facing this problem for the first time in humanity in ways that us old folks aren't, right? And so you have the unenviable and enormous responsibility of being the first ones to try to figure out some answers to these problems in ways that's kind of beyond, Professor Otteson and me, right? You're the first ones who are going to be living with the widespread, long-term, systematic consequences at a social level of these technologies. And for that, I'm a grandfather now. I got 3 grandkids. I fear much more for my grandkids than for myself when I think about AI, right? But I'm also hopeful because we all have human hearts. It tells us what's true and what's not, what's good and what's not. Use them. Use them. For my grandkids, you have to use them in order to bring some discipline and order and direction to the technologies that are being put in front of you, and not just become passive victims of them. And as I put it, literally, it wasn't an exaggeration when I said, if you don't, you'll become enslaved by them. Be free, use them, put them to use for you, and don't become used by them. That's the answer. There was another one up here in the front, and then Jim and...
Hi, my name is Joseph. I'm a senior studying physics and theology. And I was curious, to what extent do you think that the perils involved for people who are, say, training AI models or creating digital technologies that automate human decisions parallel the sort of dangers that could befall passive consumers of digital technologies who are then allowing those tools to guide them and to make decisions for them? Do you see any analog between the two separate responsibilities of creators and consumers? Yeah,
interesting. So in his far too generous introduction, Professor Otteson said more than he needed to say. But there's one thing he didn't say, and I only say it now because it helps to answer this question. One of the tasks I have right now is I'm a member and I'm one of the co-chairs of this body created by Meta Platforms called the Oversight Board, which is called to make difficult and significant content moderation decisions on Meta's platforms. And one of the things that has been most striking to me in that work is how big a gap of discourse, understanding, intelligibility there is between the technical, scientific community of creators and engineers and those of us, and all the rest of us, really. I mean, the board is, lawyers, politicians, journalists, a variety of other people. And in both directions. So this isn't a critique of the engineers any more, whatever, than it is a critique of all the rest of us. But that gap of discourse there, the gap of understanding, is enormous and a huge obstacle to us sort of making progress here. And that's the first thing that comes to mind when I think of the parallels between that and the consumer as well, right? I mean, if we don't understand the technology, we can't communicate with those who are creating the technology, and they can't communicate with us, it's very, very hard to make progress in this area. Now, again, I'll just point out, speaking here at Mendoza College of Business, and the majority of you business students or professors or people involved in the business school and the business field, those of you who will be in positions to be running these businesses have an absolutely critical role to play in bridging that gap, right? Because it's the business as a social phenomenon that is bridging the gap between the creators, the technology that is being generated, and how it interfaces with society and the consumers and the users who are the pieces of it, right? So, what we need to do is that's where it's all being built, to generate the actual dialogue that is capable of making these worlds intelligible to one another so that we can both discipline the technology but also benefit from it, right? And so that the creators go into these designing already from the start with an awareness of what are the human values we're trying to serve, rather than simply what's the most efficient outcome to reach a certain metric that's been given to me. There's a couple up here in the front, there's in the back. I don't know how to do it. I'll let Gene.
Thank you, sir. I'd like to thank you.
Then we'll go to the back after you.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I'd like to thank you for being here today. My name is Luke Monson, sophomore studying finance and classics. And one of the things I did notice you did articulate is that one of the ways that we can deal with this issue is through individual social change and through social endeavors. Are there any policy initiatives you think that should be pursued by governments around the world to address this issue of things like artificial intelligence being used to override human dignity and ingenuity?
Yes, absolutely. There is, well, I won't say anything more generally, more specifically. Yes, so the answer at a level of policy, regulation, so forth, has to be multifaceted and complex, okay? So the oversight board that I'm a part of is a form of self-regulation. That's a really important part of the ecosystem. And more companies need to take on that kind of experiment. Internal education of people in the community is an important part of it. But government regulation, although it can easily be too heavy-handed in the sphere, and we could talk about examples, but that has to be an important part of it too, right? There's no question. There's a constructive role, and in that for establishing sort of certain common public values and parameters and norms for us, North Stars to orient this stuff towards. And the difficulty of doing that right now, at least one of the biggest difficulties that I see, is that we're in an unbelievably fragmented, competitive and regulatory environment that is becoming increasingly splintered rather than unified. And so different countries in different places are doing it in different ways or not doing it at all. And that's a huge, I think, challenge or an obstacle to arriving at good regulations. Do I see examples yet in place? Honestly, no. The European Union is the furthest along and has done some really interesting things. It's not a model that I would say is free from serious criticism as well. The U.S. is sort of in the opposite approach. It's done almost nothing, and it's just sort of a free-for-all kind of Wild West. Hopefully, we could have something that is reasonably in between. You see some other countries, like China, where you have authoritarian models to govern the digital space that pose very, very serious problems in a very different direction. So I don't see any good sort of paradigms right now, but a need for us to really come together to try to figure it out. How about further in the back? We've been in the front a lot.
We have time for one final question.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Luke. I'm a sophomore studying strategic management and theology. And you mentioned how we shouldn't be against technology, but focusing on ordering it so that the people using it still remain people. But to me, I view generative AI as inherently supplanting the human mind. I don't think such ordering is possible. So I'm curious, what you think, what ordering and use of generative AI would create human flourishing?
Well, that's a good question. So let me tell a story, for example. I was at can't really call it a conference. It was an event where there were lots of speakers on different subjects, and there were lots of cultural events going on. And there was a place there where they could go with their families and leave their kids, and the kids would be taken care of, right? And what they had there was a person who was, this was in Italy. It was a very noted, successful Italian playwright and screenwriter, right? Who had a lot of success in the Italian film industry and stage. And they brought him in to talk to the kids. And so he gathers the kids around them and he sits down with them and he says, we're going to create a film together, right? And he starts asking them for the ideas. What should this film be about? And he starts using a generative AI tool in dialogue with them to create something on the spot with them. right? He says, okay, let's put in this character. They put in this character, and that character gets created. He says, what is this character going to do? And they'll get suggestions, and they decided together and reached a consensus. He said, okay, the group wants the character to do this, and what's going to happen to this character, et cetera. And they built together this little film based on a screenplay that these pre-teen kids in dialogue with him had done, using this as a tool of their creativity. Okay? Now, maybe that's an exceptional example. I share a lot of your sort of concern about it, but it says to me that the creativity of human mind and human people and human society can find ways to use it. What did it do in that case? It brought people together. It educated. It made them more generative of something, in community. It didn't substitute for their human relations or for their decisions or for their knowledge, right? I think we can find ways. It's hard, and we have to work hard at it. But that's what human beings are for. Thanks.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your time, for coming to the talk on behalf of the Mendoza College of Business. We have a small gift for you.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah,
Please join me in thanking Professor Carozza.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.